Hi, this is John Brown from Mobilize.net. In this video, we'll talk a little about Model View Controller, or MVC, and how we use ASP.NET MVC in the generated code. In reality, our generated code looks a lot more like Web API than straight-ahead ASP.NET MVC. Let's get started. In addition to any database tier, every web application has at least two tiers, a front end and a back end. The back end is what happens at the web server, and the front end is what happens in the browser. The back end that's created by WebMAP consists of C# code, ASP.NET Framework, and the Model View Controller or MVC pattern. The front end is JavaScript, HTML, and CSS for page styling. A simple way to think about the architecture is that the back end generates view models, which are sent to the front end for presentation to the user. A view model is simply what the user interface looks like, including all the controls and data. When the user changes the view model, like when they enter data and click a button, changes to that view model are then sent to the back end for processing. The processing is handled by the JavaScript framework. WebMAP uses ASP.NET MVC as its basic pattern for the server side of the code. What does MVC look like? A user working on a web application sends a request to the server. The request is data serialized as a JSON object. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's just a simple way to send application state, or data if you want to think about it that way, back and forth over the web. Using JSON is one area where WebMAP resembles Web API more than ASP.NET MVC, which itself sends views. The request is handled on the server side by a controller, which is sort of a traffic cop. The controller examines a request and routes it to the correct logic file. Logic files are the part of the application that actually does stuff, like handle business logic, talk to the data layer, so on. The logic file then updates the model, which is serialized as a JSON object, and returned to the client. The client, upon receiving the updated model as JSON, updates the view, which is bound to the model, using one of two available JavaScript MVVM frameworks, either Kendo UI or AngularJS. Whew, that's a lot of stuff going on, but we'll explain it in these videos step by step. A single page application is exactly what it sounds like. It only uses one web page, but that page gets updated dynamically. Traditional websites and web apps use multiple pages that get retrieved from the server. And SPA uses AJAX to dynamically refresh the page without having to rely on a lengthy page reload. This requires the browser to do a lot more work using JavaScript, such as serializing and deserializing data and rebuilding the view. The SPA has a more complex structure, but gives the user an experience that's similar to what they'd get with a desktop application. Before we talk about the three pieces to an MVC application, let's understand where, after migration with WebMAP, the bulk of your old application code wound up. You'll find it in your logic files. Here in this ancient VB6 application, we see some event handling logic on an order request form. There's some logging and some SQL stuff happening. Pretty standard stuff. Once this VB6 app is migrated all the way to the web, though, where can we find the same logic? After migration, there is a C# file for each of the original VB6 form files. Let's look in the C# file that handles the order request form. Here's our click handler here. And while the code is a little more complicated, you can see that the same logic is implemented in basically the same way. In addition to click handlers, you've got methods that do work, as well as property getters and setters. This is also where you'll find your data layer, as shown here in the SQL code. Models don't actually do much in WebMAP generated code. They're a repository for all the data that's needed to build the view. The logic files responding to events update the model with the change data. Notice the method called build. That's where we actually create the view. If you're at all familiar with classic ASP.NET MVC, then you've seen code like this. Here are controllers taking requests for the index page or the welcome page from a browser session and returning a view as an action method. We do things a little differently. Remember, this is a single page application, so there's no separate page links like index or welcome. Instead, we have events like button clicks. We convert every event handler into an action method to return a new view. You can get a pretty good sense here of what the controller's doing. They're all pretty similar in that regardless of the event, they return something called app changes. We'll talk about what that is later. This thing here, building, it's not used by WebMAP. You can zap it if you want. Views are really nothing more than what the user actually sees. If you think back to the days of VB6, when we created forms with controls, we styled those with these properties. We could set position, background color, fonts, all kinds of things. Those properties were stored in the form file as text values. In the days of Windows forms, those same properties were largely stored in designer files, something that you were never supposed to edit directly in Visual Studio. But they were really just C# files specifying many of the same thing that those VB6 form files specified. Getting back to ASP.NET MVC, this is what a typical view looks like. You have C# code interspersed with HTML tags like these headings and list elements using the Razor View engine. But in WebMAP, again, we do things a little differently. If you open the Views folder in Visual Studio, you won't find specific views for each application form. Instead, you'll find some, let's call it housekeeping, files like layout, CS.html, and web.config. Let's look instead in this folder called Resources. Here we'll find a pair of files for every form in our original application, one HTML file and one CSS file. Let's look. This doesn't look like most HTML you're used to, does it? That's because, unlike a web page, we really only have a couple of different kinds of objects on these forms. We have labels and we have input controls. Each one basically gets a unique ID, and those elements are styled in the CSS files, like here. This is not only where we can find the properties migrated from those WinForms designer files, but also where we can make both global changes to the look and feel of the application, as well as improve or fix the positioning and styling of the individual bits and pieces. This is pretty cool because unlike a VB app or a WinForms app, dropping in a whole new style sheet can instantly change the look and feel of your application. And it doesn't take a C# programmer to do it. The styling is done with cascading style sheets, also known as CSS. If you're not familiar with them, you can find lots of resources online to learn how to write CSS. Or just hire a web designer. That's what they do. In this video, we've explored how WebMAP application architecture is both similar to and different from a classic ASP.NET MVC application. The main difference is that WebMAP creates a single-page application on the client side. So instead of the server sending pages based on URL requests, it's updating a single page dynamically with JSON based on event handling logic.